Blood, guts, violence, cricket bats, chainsaws, decapitation, and dismemberment. You can find all of those things, and more, in a plethora of different video games, from all the way back at the ancient shores of hell in Doom, up until modern games, such as Gears of War, Left 4 Dead 2, and more. Some of these games use these effects for visceral feedback, while others use them to shock the player. Regardless, video games have used over-the-top violence since their inception, and this isn't a bad thing. Games such as Doom and Metal Gear Rising use violence in order to accentuate the absurdness of what's going on, which adds to both mechanical and emotional power fantasies for the player. Others, particularly in horror games, use these formulas to add a sense of danger or uneasiness for the player. However, despite this, games are not always unaware of how this violence may look a bit absurd and over the top to an outsider. Some of the most violent and outrageous games out there, like Hotline Miami and Spec Ops The Line, try and subvert player expectations by asking questions such as, do you like hurting other people? Both Hotline Miami and Spec Ops The Line somehow managed to get into the typical video game player's psyche and get them to look at how outrageous their actions really are. The way these games manage to do this is by attempting to remove the disconnect between what the player is doing in a mechanical sense and what they're doing in a narrative sense. To put it simply, they attempt to make the act of pointing and clicking on things an emotional experience for the player. Now, fair warning, there will be spoilers for both Hotline Miami and Spec Ops The Line ahead. Unless you like hurting your experience of these products, turn back now. What follows will essentially completely spoil Spec Ops and have minor spoilers for Hotline Miami. So you've been warned, watch out. In case you're one of the 2 people who didn't already know this, Hotline Miami is pretty violent. It's probably one of the most violent games I've ever played, and this is despite its retro aesthetic. In fact, I think that the retro aesthetic actually is what makes the game so violent to begin with. Because the action on the screen is so abstracted, your mind just kind of has to fill in the blanks, and it makes everything look far worse than it would if it was rendered in the most realistic 3D. Everything you do in this game, from melee kills to shotgun blasts, causes something or someone to become bloody pulp that spurts out viscera and gore, and the game just revels in that fact. It knows that this is a disturbing sight, yet it manages to use it to create feedback for the player and get them hooked on what is an amazing combat system because of it. Combine this with fast deaths, resets, and the music, and you get the player to be put in an almost trance-like state, wanting to kill these little pixelated men over and over again. The player gets a rhythm going, and then finally, they get the feeling of satisfaction that few games manage to achieve when they finally beat that level they're working on. The player then wants more virtual blood on their hands, and the game knows this. The game constantly confronts the player about this. Do you like hurting other people, it says? And the answer is, whether or not the player really realizes it, yes. The player will continue to play the game and to keep getting that feeling of satisfaction that the gameplay mechanics allow. During the course of the game, the message that the player gets is one and the same as the player's character gets. When the game asks questions to the player character Jacket, they are also talking to the player themselves. This effectively makes the player look back upon their experiences throughout the game and see how little context or reason they needed to kill all of these people. Spec Ops The Line does a similar thing. In this game, the player follows a roller coaster of different set pieces that are created specifically to subvert what the player would expect from a generic modern military shooter. The game opens with your standard assortment of US soldiers versus nameless brown people, before they quickly devolve into fighting a morally grey blue-on-blue sort of combat scenario. The player is encouraged to blindly play through the game, and expects little of the consequences of their actions. However, the player progresses through the set pieces, they'll slowly begin to see the horrible consequences of their actions, and the game outright scolds them for continuing to play the game in the final act.
Open your eyes, Walker. I need you to see what you've done. Dubai should have died long ago. We were ordered to abandon these people. Instead, we chose damnation.
Not all of us.
What? Who's there?
One of your victims. One who was just following orders.
You gave us no choice.
There was always a choice. You just fucked it up.
We tried to save you.
Deep down, you knew we all had to die.
The game attempts to make the player feel the responsibility for everything they've done, from the death of their team to the murder of hundreds of innocents. Most people who play this game will be eager to tell you about how bad they felt after they used the white phosphorus towards the beginning of the game, and how this choice made them feel horrible afterwards. However, while there's no doubt that this is actually an extremely hard-hitting moment in the game, I find it's actually a bit undermined by the fact that you don't have a choice. I didn't kill those people. The game did. Seriously, if you haven't already, try to fight your way through that area without using the artillery. It's literally impossible. You can't progress without doing it. The game just simply won't let you. The same goes for nearly every aspect of this game. Nothing the player does affects the outcome of the story, other than of course the decision at the very end that splits into the various different endings. However, there is one player-driven moment in the story which, in my opinion, is the most effective at making the player feel guilty. And I don't think many people realize they even had a choice here. What I'm talking about is that section towards the start of the final act of the game, where the player and their last surviving team member are surrounded by a group of rowdy civilians. The game just tries its darndest to get the player to shoot these guys. And it's something the player is instinctively told not to do by the fact that their UI lights up with a little blue indicator. During my first playthrough of this game, I had to fight the instinctual urge to avoiding shooting something that my reticule said is friendly. Something that every other shooter has ingrained in my head is the wrong thing to do. I legitimately felt bad when I did this the first time, but I got over it pretty soon. It was something, there was heaps of other stuff that I'd done that overshadowed that in the game, and it wasn't something you really looked back on. However, when I finished the game, I found out that it was actually possible to get past that crowd without shooting them. You could just simply shoot in the air above them and they'll all disperse. And that just made me feel so much worse. I did that, not the game. I chose to kill those virtual people, and I felt all the worse for it. Now, don't get me wrong here. My issues with Spec Ops are really quite specific, and they only show themselves if the player actively foresees what the game is trying to get at ahead of time, or if they do a repeat playthrough. But Hotline Miami also commits a similar sin. The game gives you no choice but to continue with gruesome murders of nondescript people, unless you turn off the game, and that's not very satisfying, is it? But I feel like it still manages to convey its message in what is at least a somewhat believable manner. Hotline Miami might not reach the same emotional lows and highs as Spec Ops, but I feel like it manages to convey its message more efficiently, because the gameplay is actually fun. Spec Ops' third-person shooter gameplay, gets the job done, but it's not great. It's not enough to drive the player on by itself, so it has to rely on making the player believe that they had at least some control over the bigger set pieces to get the whole "you enjoy killing people at the expense of others" whole story across. Hotline Miami, on the other hand, has the gameplay that is extremely enjoyable just on its own, so it has the ability to call the player out on enjoying this without making the player feel like they had to make any decisions. Basically, what I'm trying to get at here is Spec Ops needed to have more player-driven points in the story because the moment-to-moment gameplay isn't good enough to make the player feel bad if the game condemns them for it. People who play Spec Ops aren't there for the gameplay. They're there either because they thought it was just going to be some sort of generic third-person shooter, or because they wanted to experience a really good narrative. Spec Ops manages to do both of these things, but because the gameplay is mediocre at best, it cannot condemn the player for enjoying the virtual murder from a gameplay perspective. It's also hard for it to do from a narrative perspective, because the player has no choice in the matter, and still gets upset for the player for doing what they had no option to do. Basically what's happening here is the game can't say, "Player, you're doing a bad job," when the player could only do what the game wanted it to. It's the game's fault, not the player's. So what I'm getting at here is this. You can't make a video game player feel bad about doing something that was their only choice. At least not to a huge degree. You need to make them feel as if they actively made the decision that caused the negative consequence. Then they'll really start to feel bad. Games like The Walking Dead or even Wolfenstein: The New Order make the player feel really bad about themselves when someone they care about dies because of player-driven actions. So why can't these games do the same thing with their whole "you like hurting other people"? Spec Ops got close, but in my opinion, they still missed the mark. Hotline Miami did even better, as the enduring combat system was something that the player actively participates in. But I still feel like the whole thing can be done a lot better. But it requires a lot more responsibility to be given to the players. Because you can't make someone feel bad for doing something they didn't actually do.